Welcome to Unit 3. You survived two whole units worth of context, and now you are ready for more context. Hooray! I'm excited. So, just a quick recap, kind of prime us for what's coming. Last unit, as you'll recall, we ended really with this transformation of the Roman world. Rome, big articulated state that in so many ways looks closer to a modern state than anything that came before or after, falls dramatically, or at least one half of it does, Western Rome, right? We saw this decline spurred on, at least in part, by the arrival of, in many cases, hundreds of thousands of barbarian refugees into the borders of Rome, a crisis that they simply couldn't handle and one that frequently turned violent. Now, whatever the causality of that transformation, and even the chronology of it is somewhat debated in terms of how much decline happened before Roman government in the West disappeared and how much really was a much more gradual transformation than that. Either way, it's safe to say that we saw some pretty major transformations in society. Some of that, I think, is fair to say, constitutes a bit of a collapse. Demographic contraction, economic contraction to the point where trade exists only in some kind of trickle, and in a little bit here, a large-scale export of slaves to Islamic land is really the principal form of trade that exists from the perennial war and struggle of these early medieval kingdoms. Demographically, maybe up to a 50% population decline. Cities in the northern part of the Western Roman Empire basically disappear or become ghost towns practically. In the south, a little bit more continuity, but still massive deurbanization, even beyond what the limits of the demographic contraction could possibly explain. So, pretty significant decline in the West to start, reorganization politically into these so-called barbarian kingdoms that are not quite Roman, but not quite Germanic either, or anything in between. They're fundamentally new. And you begin this process of interesting cultural exchange between sort of these Germanic traditional kernels of culture and almost much more influentially, shared reception of Western Roman and Christian culture that pervades. That was the fate of the western half of the empire, but that's only the western half of the empire, right? 476, that date you have to memorize. Not much of a dramatic event, even in the West. You could be right there and miss it because nothing really changes significantly in 476 except the last ineffectual puppet child emperor is deposed and replaced by another guy who continues ruling in almost the exact same way, but happens not to identify as a Roman per se. But the Eastern Empire survives, right? It survives all the way till 1453. So 476 is the wrong date to memorize for when Rome falls. That's just the western half in an imperial transition. 1453, which we'll also get to talk about in this class in the context of the Crusades leading up to it, that's when Rome falls, really. And I have Byzantinist friends who will happily Batman Robin slap you in the face if you say Rome falls in 476. Actually gets to be a little political, and that's true also in the Middle Ages, as we'll see. So what do we mean? The Eastern Roman Empire survived, sure, but what survived? Well, principally imperial government. There continues to be Roman emperors. You could talk about Roman government as a 2000 plus year phenomenon, and you would not be wrong. There is a fundamental continuity that continues that whole time. But it's more than just governmental structure, right? The East remains much wealthier, at least at first, much, much wealthier than the West, and for centuries into the period we're covering in this first little blitz of context. Trade remains reasonably strong, at least far more advanced than what the kinds of trade networks we're seeing in the West. Urbanism remains culturally important and economically important in a way that it simply didn't in the West until we start to get back into the High Middle Ages. We call this the Byzantine world, but that's us, right? That's our labels. To them, they're Roman. They don't even qualify to say Eastern Roman because why would they? Western Rome's gone. There's only one Roman emperor and they're Romans. And they continue to identify as Romans without interruption all the way until 1453. Modern scholars sometimes call them Byzantines for convenience. The Byzantine Empire or Byzantium, those two terms are used interchangeably. Medieval people in the Latin West would call them Greeks, mostly just to piss them off, honestly. There's not a great reason for it. Um, I guess there's the argument that things really had changed to a certain extent. This is why we're so inclined to call them Byzantines instead of Romans. To clarify that, geographically, there's a major change here. The Eastern Roman Empire is only half of what the Roman Empire had been, and it doesn't even include the city of Rome. So calling them Roman gets a little confusing there. Um, and as we'll see today, this unit, that contracts pretty quickly too. Another half of that gets cut off by the Islamic conquests. So geographic contraction, absolutely. Military contraction, bureaucratic contraction, economic contraction, really the story of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, if you zoom out far enough, is one of gradual decline throughout its whole existence. That's oversimplifying it pretty substantially. You do get sustained periods of economic resurgence, of geographic expansion, but over the course of the millennium, it's gradual decline, with sometimes intense decline, as when the Islamic Empire captures about half of the Byzantine territory, and that will increase further from there. So, decline punctuated by expansion. Of course, another reason why the Western Europeans call the Byzantines Greek is because their official language in the 7th century becomes Greek, and the popular language had always been Greek in the eastern half, which wasn't really a contradiction. You could be Roman and speak Greek, no big deal, right? Meanwhile, a third inheritor enters the scene, the Islamic world, and we call it an inheritor of Rome, even though Islam, I should say, originate in the Western Arabian Peninsula, which was only very briefly ever under Roman control. But with the early expansion of Islam, the conquest of important intellectual centers like Antioch and Alexandria, the Greco-Roman scholarly tradition of science and philosophy is absorbed into Islam, and Islamic scholars prove much more faithful in preserving the classical scholars than do their Western contemporaries in Byzantium, or especially in the Western world, the Western European Latin-speaking world. So, very much you get this fruitful preservation and a fruitful synthesis with the Persian scholarly tradition, such that Islamic culture is far more advanced intellectually and far more advanced economically than either of the other two sibling inheritors of Rome. Of course, beyond the intellectual tradition, there's the fact that geographically, a solid chunk of what had been the Roman Empire falls under Islamic hands. Not quite a third, but not so far from that number either. And religiously, the overlap cannot be overstated. You know, a lot of modern people try to make a kind of false divide between Christianity and Islam to make these two religions alien to each other. Now, in the primary source readings for this week, you'll see ample evidence that that is not how medieval people thought at all. They saw the proximity of their religion, and they weren't making it up either. Even down to the name of God, you can see that this is a continuing tradition. The Hebrew Tanakh, or the Christian Old Testament, names God Yahweh or Elohim interchangeably, as it were. And that goes back to an older Phoenician god El. But Elohim is in Aramaic Elah and in Arabic Allah. It's the same word, just in different dialects of a Semitic language family. What does that mean? Well, that means, for example, when we translate the Shahada, the fundamental profession of Islamic faith, as there is no God but Allah, we're doing some violence to the language. You should say either there is no Allah but Allah, or there is no God but God, and let's go with the latter, because it is the same God. Quibbling over that point is foolish. Muslims and Christians, almost without fail, except for when they intentionally decided to ignore this, were fully aware they were worshiping the same God and the same tradition. The Quran is pitched fundamentally as a continuation of the Hebrew Bible, of the Christian Bible, as final and most perfect iteration. And because of that overlap, Christians and Muslims and Jews too had a shared tradition, a shared heritage that they recognized and therefore tolerated each other with. Jews and Christians in the Islamic world pretty quickly ended up, it took a little bit to develop, and you'll see that in the readings too, but pretty quickly ended up with the protected status of dhimmi, protected minorities who, as long as they paid the jizya, a nominal tax as it were free to practice their religion without too much of a restriction. Some restrictions. You'll see some of those too, in the so-called Pact of Umar. But analogous to the kinds of things we see for Jews and Muslims living in the Christian world. Again, continuity and tolerance characterized these sibling cultures for much of their existence leading up to the First Crusade.